Okay, hello everybody, and this is another in a series of interviews I've been doing called Crossing the Boundary with boundary crossers, people who have passed through various transitions and changes, often dramatic shifts in identity, spiritual paths, religious or political or psychological changes, and are doing really good work in the world to make this a better world. So I'm very happy to have this interview with Ken Cohen. And Ken and I met, and I don't remember exactly what year it was, but I know it was well over 10 years ago. And I met him when he was visiting New York, and we met in a hotel room in Queens. And I remember he brought me up to his room and he fixed me some very strong tea. And he told me about the origins of the tea and what tree it came from. And it was a fascinating beginning of a very fascinating discussion. And I remember I came home and I told my wife, well, I'm really glad I'm writing this book. By the way, that book is Crossing the Boundary: Stories of Spiritual Jewish Leaders of Other Spiritual Paths. And Ken is one of the people I interviewed. And I came home and I told my wife, what an amazing person I met, that you won't believe this guy's life. So we'll touch on some of that story. And here is a little bit about Ken. He's a world-renowned health educator, China scholar, and Qigong grandmaster with more than 50 years experience. He's the author of internationally acclaimed books, The Way of Qigong, The Art and Science of Chinese Energy Healing, and also Honoring the Medicine, The Essential Guide to Native American Healing. He has best-selling audio and DVD courses, 200 articles in journals. He lectures, offers workshops, classes, and teacher trainings, as well as doing healing and consultations in Colorado, California, and many parts of the world. Ken is a leader in the dialogue between ancient wisdom and modern science. His workshops, lectures, and keynotes have been sponsored by the American Cancer Society, the Mayo Clinic, Health Canada, the International Conference on Taoist Studies, and numerous medical schools, universities, conferences, and cultural organizations. So welcome, Ken. I'm happy to be able to talk to you again. And I was looking over the interview that we did, that I have that version of it in the book, Crossing the Boundary. And in looking over it, I see that since I was focused at the time primarily on Jewish identity as a question, I asked you a whole bunch of questions where it seemed, as in reading it now, that I was kind of shocked by the lack of identity, having both a Jewish mother and father, that you seem to have about being Jewish when you were a child.
Although I remember I do have also adoptive Cree Indian family. There's no question that my ethnic background is Ashkenazi Jewish.
Yeah.
But I'm just a lucky guy. I've also got another family originally from Sturgeon Lake First Nation in Saskatchewan. And I stay very close to them, especially my adoptive brother, who's a storyteller and educator. So again, I don't deny my own background, my own ethnic background, but I feel very blessed that I've been able to cross so many boundaries in my life, or at least dissolve rigid boundaries between peoples and culture. But please go on, Alan. And I also want to say, it's just such an honor to sit here with you because you're a boundary crosser. I mean, your writing is amazing, and the blogs and things I've read that you've written, and your activism against for social justice. I think we share the same values, which I really wasn't. I mean, I suspected that, but I didn't know it for sure when you did the interview. I just knew the subject of your book. But then as I started reading more of the things that you were writing, I realized that you were a like-minded soul.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ken. I very much appreciate that. So coming back to that question of Jewish identity, which you didn't have very much of subjectively, really, it sounds like when you were a kid. How has that evolved? Just in terms of maybe since we talked, or
Sure. Well, I didn't really have any Jewish education, and people find that unusual because I'm a Cohen, which is the only, I think it's the only surname that exists today that you find in the Bible. It means priest, so we are descended from Aaron, brother of Moses. But my parents were not involved in any way. In fact, the first time that I met a rabbi, and I think I mentioned this in your book, was when I was in my 20s, when a Jewish rabbi called me wanting to take Tai Chi classes with me. He wanted to study Tai Chi as an introduction to Buddhism and Taoism, which he knew informed Tai Chi and other Chinese arts. And he wanted to also explore possible connections between Buddhism, Taoism, and Jewish mysticism, about which I knew nothing. So that was my first time getting to know a rabbi. And actually, our conversations after our private Tai Chi classes were so fascinating to me that, I mean, it blew my mind. I realized I had grown up with stereotypes about
is
Jewish.
that Bert Jacobson?
Yes, Bert Jacobson, Rabbi Bert.
Yeah.
And who was sort of protege of Abraham Joshua Heschel. I mean, he comes from quite a wonderful lineage of Jewish teachers himself. But because of our conversations, I realized that I had grown up accepting Christian stereotypes about Jews. I mean, not coming from my parents, who were respectful of all people, but just from the general milieu of growing up in American society, growing up in New York. And that was quickly deconstructed, and a very different view of Judaism emerged because of those conversations, and later enrolling in a semester of Rabbinic Judaism, and then Hasidic Judaism with Rabbi Bert, and then a semester of Zohar studies with Danny Matt, the great translator of the Zohar. So that really opened a window to me in my own ancestry, and made me rethink my relationship with Judaism, and remembering also stories that my mother especially did share, since her mom came from the old country, came from Vitebsk and that region in Belarus. And I know that my grandmother, Grandma Rose, her brother died in her arms when the Tsar's soldiers stormed their home, just looking for Jews to randomly shoot and kill. So there was definitely that trauma in my family, and I'm sure in generations back as well. So it's been a fascinating journey for me to learn more about Judaism, about Jewish history, and to learn more about my parents. Now I guess in Judaism, when someone loses both their parents, they're called an orphan, is what I found out recently. So now I'm an orphan. My mom passed on in 2016. My dad just last June, and both were pretty extraordinary people in their own way. My mom, I think, was an example to me of the power of love, and truly unconditional love and support. And I think she got that from her mom, and from her dad, my grandfather, a great sense of humor. I still like to entertain children with what my grandpa taught me. Did you see, did you see my eyes go around and around in a circle?
So Groucho Marx kind of.
Yes, he was the kind of grandpa that I was always bringing my little friends over to see. So I would say, "Grandpa, do something funny," and everybody would crack up. And then my dad, I didn't really know that much about his personal story until the last year of his life. He passed at age 95, and he started telling us things that I never knew about. One of them was that where he grew up in the Bronx, which was originally a very very diverse neighborhood. I think when my grandfather got the house, there were Irish Americans and Italians and Black people and Jews and all kinds of people. But by the time my father was in his early teens, that neighborhood was the center of the US Nazi Party.
No.
And he was beaten
Wow.
every day on the way to school or on the way back by kids his age or a little bit older who were just looking for Jewish victims. And I realized that him telling me this story, which I had never heard my entire life, him telling me this story during the last year of his life, that this filled in, kind of piece of the puzzle. I mean, we're always learning about ourselves, always learning about our parents. But this was an important piece because it helped explain to me his passion against injustice and against racism, his absolute outrage at the way Black people were being treated during the time of Dr. Martin Luther King. We were glued to the television, and I remember my father just yelling in disgust about how can white people treat other people that way.
Right.
So his hatred of injustice, and then his volunteering during the Second World War. As soon as he was eligible by his age, he joined the Navy, and he really became a naval hero. He was the one who, on the USS Wisconsin, detected the German U-boat. He was the sonar and radar man. He detected the German U-boat that was traveling with enriched uranium to Japan, where there was a collaboration, I guess, between Germany and Japan to create an atomic bomb. It wasn't just the US that was working on it. So he was the one who detected that U-boat, which was later forced to surface. And then he later worked for US Navy intelligence. And a lot of these things he never spoke about because he didn't realize that this was already mentioned in the histories. And he took very seriously, and I'm proud of him for this, he took very seriously his vow of secrecy. And only
So the
when he
passion,
realized,
it sounds like the passion for justice and the passion for social justice, you feel came out of what he experienced by these Nazi youth. On the other hand, we often even have commented in previous discussions how the abused sometimes become the abuser. And why is it that you think that in this case, he didn't go that route instead of the route that he chose, where the abused becomes the champion of and fighter for justice? And
well, I think a lot of it, I know this sounds rather simplistic, but I think a lot of it comes down to courage. The courage to stand by one's principles and what one knows is right, rather than allowing bitterness to form around the heart, or becoming a reactive person, where, as you say, the abused might become the abuser. That didn't happen.
That didn't happen for him.
Yeah.
And he passed along to you that transmission, which some people feel is a major part of the Jewish transmission, culturally at least, is the sensibility to be a fighter for social justice.
Absolutely. And, it reminds me of a vision I once had in my work in indigenous medicine, which I've been equally involved in my entire life. I was looking for an answer of how to deal personally with terrible injustice. This was in response to some experiences I had, and also people that I know who had been consulting with me. And I really had this sincere question that I wanted to ask Spirit, wanted to ask Creator, what is the best way on a personal level? I'm not talking about the activism and the fight against injustice and voting. All those things are important. But what do we need to do for ourselves when faced with something that could be so trauma-inducing or personally devastating? And I received the following messages while I was out praying in nature, in the wilderness. Number one is release the injustice, the whole situation, up to Creator. Never return fire directly. That is, I mean, again, I don't want people to misunderstand. I'm not saying you shouldn't be an activist, not at all. But to preserve our personal well-being, especially our psychological and spiritual well-being. One of my elders, Inchuk, an Innu elder, not the Inuit, Innu. They're from, they're sometimes called the Montagnais. They're from Quebec in Canada and also Labrador and Baffin Island. They're closely related to the Cree in the Algonquin language and cultural family. So Inchuk, who I've known since my early 20s, told me that when something terrible happens to you, release it up to Creator and never indulge in negative thinking. Be aware of the injustice, but don't allow your mind to turn to what some people would say the dark side of the force. So the first message I received when I was praying in the wilderness, release the situation to the Creator with no thought of outcome. Number two, don't allow any negative thinking, because from an indigenous viewpoint, people who might have done you harm, they are being controlled by a negative force, a negative spirit. And if you think in a negative way, you'll be strengthening that spirit. They feed on it. So don't allow yourself to wallow in either self-pity or in reactiveness, hatred, negative thinking. Again, be aware of the injustice, but don't let that turn your mind. The third message I received while praying is don't allow even a single shell of bitterness to form around your heart. Because if you allow that to happen, you will no longer be a complete human being. You will be living within a shell, not nurtured or nourished by by other people, by your surroundings, by nature, by the divine. So don't allow a single shell to form around your heart. And that's not easy. No. And then the fourth message I received, again, during this quest, you could say, for guidance, was do whatever is necessary to keep your heart fully capable of receiving and giving love. And that will differ for every person. For some, it might mean just time spent in personal meditation and introspection. For others, it might mean listening to music, reading poetry, doing art, dancing. It could be anything, but keep the heart capable of receiving and giving love. So those are the four messages about dealing with injustice. They've served me well. They've evidently served others well also in my work doing some consulting and counseling. Because again, remember, I think people familiar with your book, Alan, will remember that I am equally devoted, you could say, to two paths in my life. While acknowledging my ethnic Jewish background and greatly respecting it, I had, for whatever reason, I don't quite know why, I had the honor of meeting extraordinary, I didn't go looking for them, meeting extraordinary Native American and First Nations elders and being trained kind of old school, rather strictly by them, being tested by them, but also learning the Chinese language. And I love the Chinese healing arts, Qigong, and I love the martial arts. In fact, I've gone back to a lot of martial arts training. I'm finding it's great for health. You get good cardiovascular workout, and I just enjoy it tremendously.
So besides Qigong?
Yes. I've been doing martial arts all along, and I don't think you could name a style of martial arts where I haven't sparred with a practitioner. I've worked out with, I remember our martial arts school, the Tai Chi school where I studied. I was originally trained with Grandmaster William C.C. Chen. And his school was right down the block from an equally well-known Taekwondo school. And some of the black belts used to come over to our school just for some friendly sparring where we could learn from each other, from our respective strengths and weaknesses. And I loved sparring with people that do Taekwondo, but I've also sparred with people that do Tiger Claw, Western boxing, praying mantis, you name it. And some people might say, well, isn't that sort of a contradiction? You're into healing arts, but you're into martial arts? No, it's one system. From the Chinese viewpoint, it's one system. Even Tai Chi, every single movement is the vocabulary of a martial arts technique, the same skill set that you need for relaxed, well-coordinated, balanced movement, which is good for health, you also need in the practice of martial arts. And in the martial arts, you got another interesting thing going on. When you're doing Tai Chi or any Qigong set, it's sort of difficult for the teacher to tell if your mind is really with it. Maybe the student is doing, I can usually tell because the body does reflect the state of mind. But for some teachers, they might not be able to tell that while the student is doing Tai Chi, they're thinking about the new pizza place that's about to open, or something else. But in the martial arts, your mind wanders, and guess what? You get the feedback right away. Maybe you're hit in the face or kicked in the gut. Right. So it forces you to be attentive. I remember when I was at William Ched's school, people used to always, I had somewhat of a reputation. In fact, one of my colleagues there told me, he said, Ken, why is it that you always smile, sometimes to the point of laughing whenever I punch you, whenever you get hit? I said, because it's wonderful. That's how I'm learning. If nobody hits me, I'm not going to learn anything. It's great. Now I can improve. In fact, someone would hit me and I'd say, oh, let's set that up again. Let's see if you could do that again. And I try to figure out, how I need to move out of the way, what I need to do to be able to effectively counter it while maintaining the principles of that specific art, such as Tai Chi. Yeah. So all these things.
So Ken, let me stop you for a second. Yeah. You roll along, and I want to come back to what you said about that vision that you had of the four things you were told, because I don't want to let that pass by without just commenting on what a profound spiritual teaching just for life that is, not just for dealing with the tragedies of life, but just being attentive to what it is that we face all the time in every moment going through life.
I think it's quite important. Yeah, and give the situation
and
up.
It involves many aspects of processes that relate to Judaism, relate to Native American teachings, relate to Taoism. And so regarding Taoism and your involvement with it, you've written a book about it, you teach it all the time. Can you give us a capsule sense of, like, what is it? What is it telling us? And also,
big question.
If you could go a little further, how does Taoism help us relate to what's going on in the world right now?
Okay, so the first one, and remind me if I get lost in my answer and forget your second question, you'll remind me. What is Taoism? Of course, this is an almost impossible thing to answer. Yet, I guess it's the job of poets to express the inexpressible. So I will do my best, make my best attempt. Because remember, Lao Tzu begins his Tao Te Ching, his classic of Taoism, written in the 5th century BC, begins by saying, Dao ke Dao, fei chang Dao. The Tao that can be spoken of is not the Tao.
Right.
Well, notice something interesting about that sentence. Listen to it in Chinese. Dao ke Dao, fei chang Dao. Literally, the Tao that can be Taoed is not the Tao. The word Tao has a wide range of meanings, but one of the other meanings besides the balanced path of life, you could say the way of nature, is it can mean to speak. So the Tao that can be spoken about, the path that can be trod, is not the path, is not the word. You see the possible range of translations, but on a more basic level, Lao Tzu is communicating through style the content that is Dao ke Dao, fei chang Dao. Lao Tzu uses the word Dao 3 times in that sentence, each time with a different meaning. I believe the term Dao appears 76 times in total in the Tao Te Ching, within the 81 chapters of the Tao Te Ching. Again, each time with a slightly different meaning. So what is Lao Tzu saying? What is Taoism about? It's about getting rid of rigidity, especially rigid concepts of oneself, so one can adapt to change intelligently, and learning to know and understand where you need to flow with the current, or where you might need to gently redirect it. Or even at times in life, we might have to flow upstream for a while, especially if the whole world is acting crazy, but we know that there's a better way to live. That's a little bit of the answer to your second question, by the way. Now, when Lao Tzu himself, in his classic, summarizes the teachings of Taoism, I think we can see it best in seeing if I still have this information in my mind. Yes, in a phrase from the Tao Te Ching, Jian Su Bao Pu Shao Se Kwa Yu. See the unbleached silk, embrace the uncarved block of wood, lessen selfishness, reduce greed and grasping. So what does he mean by see the unbleached silk, embrace the uncarved block of wood? It means find out your original nature, free of the conditioning influences of language, culture, education, religion. Don't bleach the silk, don't carve the wood according to the rules of right and wrong, according to the laws of society. Yes, we're going to follow the laws, but not because we are compulsively trying to follow a set of rules, but because we've discovered who we are. And I would say there is a natural benevolence and goodness in the human heart that is largely covered over by our attempt to be good, by our educational systems. So Lao Tzu says, find out your raw, wild nature and respect it. But at the same time, reduce selfishness and greed and grasping. So I would say that's, the essence of Taoism as a philosophy. There's also Taoist religion. I mean, there were no Taoist monasteries at the time that Lao Tzu wrote or dictated his text. There are ritual practices. There's even liturgy that supports Taoist practice. But even in the monastic setting, the philosophy of respecting nature, of flowing with change, of uncovering the essence of who we are, the importance of simplicity, of naturalness, that remains at the core of Taoism, no matter what kind of Taoism one is practicing.
So is there a practice or method that helps one to arrive at that state of consciousness? Would you say that meditation is kind of a necessary feature so that we get beyond the concepts about not having concepts?
Yes, but as with Indian yoga, there are many paths to the Tao or to the divine. So even within Taoism, there are devotional practices, because ultimately what one realizes is that the deity that you're offering incense to, that you're bowing to, is another manifestation of the Tao, just as you are. It's not an idol. It doesn't have an absolute external reality. You and that deity are one.
You're not separate from that divine presence.
As in Bhakti Yoga, in Indian yoga. There's also the role of intellect, of study, of reading the Taoist texts, of Taoist chants, and what could be called liturgy. But meditation, I believe, I think you're right, that meditation is really central and is certainly essential, including not just meditations involving the mind, but meditations involving the body.
Absolutely.
Here another central tenet of Taoism is Xing Ming Shuang Xiu. Xing Ming Shuang Xiu. Spirit and body cultivated in balance. Spirit and body cultivated in balance. A good example would be simply observing one's breath. The way we breathe is a good indication of our harmony internally and with the external world. That is, do we allow nature as air to enter the body and to leave with equal ease and grace? Or are we trying to hold on to the world and to life as a possession, in which case you could say the chest may have a tendency towards being chronically inflated? Or are we, because of our life experiences or trauma, self-image, self-esteem, are we unable to be refreshed by the world? Are we literally, physically, and mentally depressed so that the chest is chronically deflated?
Mm.
When there is
Very,
a
very
true
interesting take on the difference there of two types of pathologies. I never heard that before. The overemphasis on the exhale and letting emptying, and the overemphasis on filling up. And
yes. So what we want is, again, going back to that basic principle in Taoism of change and adaptability, is we want to restore the capacity through meditation practices of receiving the world and letting it go, not treating breath as a possession. But let's go even one step deeper. I know you have other questions. Let's just go one step deeper with the breath. When the breath is in, after you've inhaled, are you pushing the breath out? There's no need to. We can trust nature. We can surrender to the wisdom of nature. That's part of Taoism. When the breath is out, after you've exhaled, there actually is a natural pause before the next inhale. Don't worry, you're not going to stop breathing. Your body knows how to breathe. Otherwise, we would be unable to sleep at night. So do you allow that pause, or are you trying to help nature along? And do you find that at the end of the exhalation, you're sucking the breath back in? So still another way breath teaches us about ourselves, about nature, about the Tao, is we surrender to nature's wisdom in breathing. We inhale without trying to draw the air in. We exhale without trying to push the breath out. And when we are truly able to let go to that inherent wisdom, the breathing rate slows down. We become less anxious, more tuned in, more capable of making wise decisions, less reactive, we have more insight into ourselves and others. When you let go of rigidity in breathing, because physiology entrains psychology, when you let go of rigidity in breathing, you're also releasing rigid ways of thinking.
yeah.
And this, of course, also requires the courage to not base one's identity on beliefs. I'm going to say that again. Having the courage to not base one's identity on beliefs or on any belief system. We are much deeper than that, much more mysterious than any set of beliefs or dogma.
Yeah, and following up with that second part of my question, I often think that it's ideological thinking, it's rigid belief-based thinking that is kind of at the root of so much of the suffering in the world and so much of the trauma that has happened to us individually and collectively. So do you see, given the kind of mind state or state of consciousness that Taoism helps us enter into, and other spiritual practices involving meditation, mindfulness, and so forth, how that relates to what we call activism, or how that relates to actually affecting the world that we're in right now, which is on a very critical point. Climate
Sure.
change,
Well, you find the
polarization,
balance
effects of
between,
the increase of fascist kinds of populist movements and so forth.
yeah. So, I mean, there still is a little bit of a tendency, I have to say, to kind of withdraw from the world's affairs in Taoism. I think that tendency is even stronger in Buddhism, but there is still a tendency not to be so socially active. I disagree with that. I think that it's important for a balanced life.
Well, isn't
That
there that classic story about the meeting between Lao Tzu and Confucius, where Lao Tzu's up on the mountaintop and Confucius is sort of involved in like trying to change the world to a more just, helpful place, and Lao Tzu kind of like blows him away, or
Yeah,
I
that's
forget exactly what this
in
is.
the Zhuangzi, who is one generation after Lao Tzu, or another very famous example in that same text is there's an old man fishing by the riverbank, and two government officials come over to him and say, "We would like to offer you a position at court." And the old fisherman says, "I have heard that in the state of Chu, there is a venerated tortoise whose bones and shell are kept at court. Now, let me ask you, would this tortoise rather be dead and venerated or be alive and dragging its tail through the mud?" The official said, "Well, it would certainly rather be alive and dragging its tail through the mud." The old fisherman said, "Well, then be gone. Let me drag my tail through the mud." So he didn't want to have an involvement in politics.
Yeah, and that's a big aspect, at least as it's come to us, or to here in the West, of a lot of the Eastern teachings, including Taoism. So how do you bring it around? How do you interface?
So the other side of the story is that Taoists have generally not been trusted by authoritarian governments, including the one or the ones in China, even during the imperial dynasties, because Taoism has such an emphasis on directly connecting with nature and not relying on one text or on a set dogma. As a result, Taoists tend to be unpredictable and they're more likely to do their own thing. Governments don't like that. So again, the other side of the story is that Taoism has at times been politically involved and has been the source of social and even military revolutions. It's why Taoism was branded in 1949, after the Communist Revolution, was branded in China as Fandong, counter-revolutionary. Taoist priests were called Fandong Daoshi, counter-revolutionary Taoist priests. To practice Taoism was considered an act of treason. So
Well, would
I
they
think
have been
the
thought of
essence,
as individualistic and libertarian in a way, as opposed to?
it's individualistic, and it emphasizes personal exploration and understanding of nature and one's own nature. And then it's up to you, in a sense, what you do with that wisdom. Do you remain sitting in the cave, or do you use your newfound insight and individualism and strength and confidence to be of positive service in the world? My own teacher, Dr. Huang, a Taoist abbot that I was an apprentice to, he felt very strongly as a Taoist that we need to use our gifts in service in the world. And this corroborates what I had learned from one of my Native American teachers. And I'm not saying, indigenous wisdom and Taoism are exactly the same, but there are points of correspondence.
Yeah.
One of my Native teachers said, if you have a gift and you don't use it, you keep it locked up inside, your own gift becomes the source of your illness.
Right.
That gift is a power that we are given by Creator in order to use it of help and in a way of service to others. Again, if we keep it locked up, it rots. It rots us from the inside. So we're called upon to use what we know, to use our insight that we gather through meditation, that we gather through Tai Chi, to help create a better world for ourselves, for the coming generations, for children, for not just for people, but for the rocks, for the plants, for the animals, for the
All around.
birds, for the
Right.
fish, for the ocean. That to me is really my dedication. I've been an activist my whole life, both through writing and through being on marches. I've been in the Women's March a couple of times, in some Native American marches as well. I support people who I feel are being treated unfairly. I fight against racism. I try to portray these things, my principles, in the way that I live, in the way I always behave towards others. And that's part of the positive gift, I would say, I received not only from my teachers as an adult, but from my parents.
Mm. I'm with you there, Ken. Absolutely. And so what about ancestors? We talk about a transmission that comes through these different lineages, and that comes through our biological ancestors, our mothers, our fathers line going all the way back. Um, do any of the teachings that you've embraced or experiences directly um, recognize or think in terms of ancestors as being sort of existent in the present moment, uh,
Yes.
not
Yeah.
just in our thoughts, but as spiritual beings that we can connect with in certain states of consciousness or
I think that's
helpful?
generally true in many spiritual traditions. I mean, think about the ancestral tablets on the traditional Chinese altar, or the offerings that are made to one's ancestors during the anniversary of their passing. Think of the beautiful Dia de Muertos, Day of the Dead. I'm not an expert in that, but I have great respect for that custom, where you visit the graves of your parents and ancestors on a special day every year. You enjoy the food that they enjoyed. You might have a picnic by the grave site. You listen to the music that they enjoyed. What a beautiful, beautiful celebration. So there is this sense in general, I think, in world spiritual traditions of ancestral wisdom, of ancestors being an influence on who we are, of being more than just a memory, and something I would even say beyond our biology. By that, I mean that we are connected in mysterious ways to not only our ethnic ancestors,
Mhm.
but at times, for some people, to additional lines of ancestry.
Yeah.
I don't know the reason why. I just know for myself and others I've met that it seems to be true. So I feel deep connection with, for example, some of my teachers. Well, let's not even talk about ancestors. My teacher, Dr. Wong, the Taoist priest who was born in 1910, he died in 1999. As I said, I was his only lifetime apprentice in Taoism and some of the healing arts and meditations and so forth. Uh, Often when I'm speaking about Taoism, and sometimes even when I'm doing healing work, people have seen him around me, sometimes not
Mm,
even knowing about him. They'll describe him to me.
mm,
My wife has seen him a
mm,
number of times.
mm,
So how does that happen? I don't know. I
mm.
don't. I just literally I do not know the answer,
Uh,
but I do feel that
but it
the
seems real. It's an experience
yes.
that you have and that people have, and um, it certainly runs across the boundary from what's known as Western scientific thinking, that all of what exists is basically the material world, and anything that seems to be beyond that is just sort of a smoke that comes out of that.
Although science is starting to change. I mean, there are
Absolutely.
there are experiments that can only be explained
Yeah.
within physics by input from an energy source that is outside of the normal dimensions of space and time. I've spoken to
Right.
physicists about this.
Right.
How do we explain the work of people like the famous Polish healer Ogil Worrell, who was able to influence a subatomic particle generator a
Oh, right.
1,000 miles away
Yeah.
through her intent? Or how do we explain things like the pair experiments, the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab,
Mhm.
where individuals in millions of experimental trials, millions, were able to influence random number generators
Uh-huh.
that should produce random strings of ones or zeros. They
Yeah.
were able to influence them to produce more ones or zeros according to their pre-stated intent.
Yeah.
How is this possible?
Yeah, a
To
lot of
me,
this is documented by the Noetic Sciences Institute,
yes,
IONS, and I'm sure you're familiar with.
yes,
Uh,
and it suggests that we are interconnected
yeah.
in this web of life in mysterious ways.
No.
We
No.
don't know all of the ways. We just know that we are literally one family
Yeah.
with all of life.
Yeah. And of course, indigenous people have known this for millennia. And this is a good opportunity then to ask you a little bit about your experience learning indigenous healing practices, Native American especially, um, and where you are with doing that right now.
Well, it's something I keep a little more quiet, not as public about it. And I'm happy to talk with you, Alan, and glad to share with people who are viewing this. But there's a different, you could say, I don't know what to call it, an ethic, different professional ethic in
Uh,
indigenous medicine, that we're not allowed to commercialize it or to charge money for healing interventions.
sure.
I mean, people can give a gift, but I've never have and never will charge a fee for doing indigenous medicine, Native American healing, what we call doctoring. And that's also true for leading ceremony, that it's considered a gift from spirit that we pass and use to help, pass on and use to help others. So that's why I
But it
don't
speaks
speak
to
about it.
this notion of the interconnectedness of everything, and that there's an energetic flow between all of what we consider to be separate phenomena.
Yes. So I consider the Qigong and Tai Chi and martial arts, which I also love, to be my, you could say, day job.
Mhm.
But equally important to me, however, not a source of income, is my work in Native American spirituality and healing, and that remains equally important. I mean, I still work with individual clients. I don't know what quite to call them. It's not really client, but we don't really have a word for it. It's not client, and it's certainly not patient. But I work with individuals who do consultations or who come to me with sometimes rather serious health challenges, or who are just looking for a new direction, new meaning in their life. Uh, and I try to help as best I can using what I've learned from so many wonderful elders and medicine people.
Yeah, it's always interesting to me the overlapping way in which the world's spiritual traditions seem to involve with each other and are finding each other now, of course, through the ability to communicate and travel that has developed so rapidly. Um, I wonder, though, as someone who has so deeply involved himself in the one and the other that appear on the surface very different, if somehow subjectively in your own mind, when you're working with native indigenous healing practices, if Taoism isn't there for you.
Oh, certainly. I mean, that's a great question, and I appreciate you asking me that. Uh, Anything that I've studied, any people I've met, any places I've been, they're all part of me. They're all who I am. It's
Yeah,
just that as an educator or as a healing practitioner, I want to do justice to the particular method that I'm being asked for. So if someone comes to me for Native American healing, I'm not going to interject Qigong or vice versa. That would be like, well, the example I like to give is, let's say someone comes for a language class with me. I don't teach languages, but Let's say I had a student who wanted to, or a group that wanted to learn French, and may no one come to me to learn French because my French is terrible. But imagine me starting a class this way. Bonjour, aujourd'hui je vais enseigner un peu de 中国话，因为我说的中国话比较流利。You would think, what? What the heck was that? Well, I started by saying, today I'm going to teach you, and then I switched to the Chinese language. And I say Chinese because my Chinese is more fluent. No one's going to learn anything. I'm mixing languages. I call that chop suey spirituality. And as Sri Ramakrishna, one of the great saints from India, put it, he said, you know, if you dig 100 wells and none are deep enough to strike water, they're all useless. So all the things I've learned influence me, but I've been really devoted, and just because of the circumstances of my life, to these two paths that are equally who I am, the indigenous and Chinese Taoist. However, I don't mix them. I try to be true to the language and the culture that I'm speaking at the time. Does that sort of answer it for you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So there's another phenomenon that's happening right now that I have a great interest in. And I know that from what you've told me, you kind of woke up to spirituality at a very early age, and quite naturally, that is, without anything coming to you even from other people, really. Many of us in the 60s had no clue about spirituality until we started experimenting with and exploring psychedelics. And as I'm sure you're aware, there is what's being called a renaissance right now in the exploration of psychedelics at universities, institutions. There's programs to legalize different substances. Have you been following some of that? And do you have any sort of feelings or thoughts about what's going on?
This is a great question. Boy, we almost need another discussion time for this, and maybe bring other people in on
it is a huge
as well. Let me say first, I'm one of those few very weird people who during the 60s, instead of smoking marijuana or taking drugs, I was listening to music, mostly Western classical music, and meditating. Again, I don't know why, but I was drawn to a very different way of thinking and living. Now, that said, I have great respect for what I usually call the teaching plants. That is things like peyote and psilocybin and ayahuasca and so forth. I have great respect for those. And I know that they have genuinely helped people overcome physical, mental, and spiritual challenges and diseases. But personally, again, not to criticize people with other ways of doing things, but personally, I feel that these sacred plants need to be used within their original context. I do not feel it is appropriate to take a plant from the Amazon and transport it to the culture of the United States, removed completely from its original peoples and homeland, give none of the benefits of the research or clinical usage or even sale, perhaps, not giving any of that back to the original peoples. It's as though the West is trying to take over the dialogue and the narrative around this medicine, rather than being guided by the original peoples and cultures and making sure they understand the repercussions of using it out of context in the United States as, let's say, a prescription from a psychiatrist. I have such reverence for these plants and for other plant medicines that I feel it is best to use for spiritual and psychological healing the plants that are local to your area. And when it is a sacred medicine, as I presume peyote, ayahuasca, and the sacred mushrooms are, then we're obliged to seek guidance from indigenous people and use it only if authorized to do so.
Yeah.
Or
It is a very big topic of discussion within the circles of people that are using these different medicines, including synthetic medicines, psychedelic medicines, is to be aware of the fact that to some extent it can be part of a continuing colonialization of process where white people from our culture are going down into the Amazon or going into areas of the Southwest and taking plants outside of the guidance of and respect for and giving back to the native people who
and sometimes, frankly, raping the earth and removing these plants so they're no longer available for the original peoples.
Well, that too.
Or getting a patent on it and then
I know.
suing others for violation of their copyright or patent over a medicine that belongs to someone else. I mean, this is very, very
But I will say
problematic.
that it's a huge discussion, and there are many, many people within the world of seeking to make helpful and healing and transformative use of these medicines, who are aware of what you're saying and are working with Native peoples to try to combine their knowledge and learn
Yeah,
from.
maybe there's a way to do that. Frankly, I just don't know. My own work has not been with those plants. Again, I respect them, but mine, I suppose you could say, is a little more traditional. So, for example, if somebody came to me with a respiratory problem, and I felt this person was, let's say, an indigenous brother or sister came to me with a respiratory problem, and I felt they were really attuned to the plant medicines.
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't work like Western herbal medicine, where I look up maybe in the PDR of herbal medicine, there is such a thing, for which plant to treat which disease. That doesn't really work that way.
Yeah.
There has to be a kind of harmony between the healer, the healy, and the spirit of that medicine, and all guided by your communion with all our relations, with the natural world, with the Creator. So let's say in this hypothetical example, I'm just making it up right now, just hypothetical example. This person has a respiratory problem, and I really sense that Osha root, Ligusticum boteri, would be of help to them. We often call that bear root, in part because of a early recognition by indigenous healers in the United States and in Canada, that, and I should say also in Mexico, that bears love to eat that particular root. And unlike human beings, they can easily distinguish it from poison hemlock, which looks rather similar. You can give a bear Osha root in captivity that's been raised in captivity and has never encountered Osha in the wild, and they behave towards it the same way as a bear that had been exposed to it all its life, living in nature. They'll chew the root and blow the mastication over a wound. So there's a deep connection between the bear and healing and Osha root. So in this example of someone who's come to me for healing, if I feel that these connections are all there, it's not enough for me to give them the root medicine. I have to go out and gather it. I'm not going to go to the herbal store and buy it. I have to go out and gather it. And I do gather this medicine as well as a number of others. And then I have to address it in the indigenous language, which I can do. And I have to sing its song, which I know. I keep about 300, maybe 350 songs in memory. I learned these the old way, through being around the elders, through being in ceremony, not through listening to CDs. I love CDs, but I didn't learn them that way. So I was given this song. I earned it. I will sing that song to honor that particular plant. And then I administer it with prayer. This is quite different, I think, than the way, unfortunately, many people think they can use medicines that essentially belong to indigenous cultures, whether it's the plant medicines like ayahuasca or anything else. Again, I'm not saying that there isn't a psychiatric or other usage for the psychoactive medicines, but I abide by the kind of ethics that I was trained in as a traditional healer.
Yeah, I hear you. That's fascinating, Ken, and I really honor what you're saying, and I'm learning a lot from it as we speak. But it does remind me we need to close pretty soon, and it does remind me that you told me that you have this have been, I don't know for how long, a growing interest. I know it's been there for a long time, but it seems to have been growing an interest in the use of tea. So if you can fairly quickly speak a little bit about what that's all about and what you're finding with it.
Sure. Well, this has also been, I mean, ever since Dr. Wong, since 1976, I've been thoroughly involved in the tea world and tea tasting, and I sell teas, Chinese teas. If I could coin a new term, we have Theravada Buddhism.
And what?
Theravada, well, Theravada Buddhism is not a new term, but you're going to hear what the new term is. You've got Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism, two of the best known schools of Buddhism. Much has been written about them. People say that Theravada Buddhism is a little more self-oriented, finding enlightenment for oneself. Mahayana Buddhism has a little more emphasis on becoming a bodhisattva, on not building a raft to bring you to the other shore, but building a ferry boat and taking other people along. But I'm going to, and some people say there's a third major method found especially in Tibet, Vajrayana Buddhism, which some assume is a quicker path to enlightenment. It has that thunder-like power, the Vajra. So we've got Theravada Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism. Now I'll coin my new term, Chayana. Tea Buddhism, the tea path to enlightenment, the quickest path. Just enjoy a wonderful cup of tea. You might think I'm being facetious. Actually, I'm not. There is a deeply transformative power to the plant Camellia sinensis. The same plant is what we drink when we drink green tea, oolong tea, which is just that green tea, but it's been oxidized. It's exposed to oxygen and moisture for a period of time and crafted in a particular way to bring out a certain aroma and flavor and qi, certain energy. It's the same plant that's used as the base for black tea, for pu'er tea. So I'm not speaking about what in French would be called a tisane, an herbal infusion, but rather tea leaf tea. It has been associated with Buddhism, although I'm joking about Chayana. Actually, tea has been certainly associated with Buddhism and Taoism from the earliest time in its history. And if it is a single estate tea or wild harvested tea, gathered with respect and love, crafted carefully by a master tea farmer, there is truly a transformative energy in the aroma and the taste of the tea. So I find tea to be a wonderful support to any type of spiritual practice. And one other thing, Alan, I know we're getting close to time, but it was poetry that first drew me to Chinese studies, my love of Chinese poetry. And something that I've been doing over the past 4 or 5 years is writing poems in English, but in the Chinese style, based on the experience of drinking tea. Let me read you one short one.
Okay. Why don't we close with a poem?
Wonderful. So this is a poem that I wrote called While Drinking Green Pu'er Tea on an Autumn Morning. And again, it's not a translation, it's my own poem. Mm-hmm. Distant and vast, the autumn mountains, a quiet murmur, the autumn river, hanging moss, beards on ancient trees, cushioned earth like walking on clouds, radiant blue sky over undulating forests, pine, bamboo, camphor, cypress, something sweet in the air, honey, forest holding memory of spring flowers. No need for temples or sutra chanting where original nature is undisturbed.
Mm. Mm. Well, thank you, Ken. And this has been a very rich experience for me. And I hope those who watch and will continue to follow up and look for you on the web and at your websites. And we'll continue to be in touch. This is a rich dialogue, which I hope to continue with you.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Blessings.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Stop.